What if the smallest truth in a courtroom was never spoken out loud, but hidden inside a child's favorite toy? The judge's gavel came down with one sharp crack that echoed across the polished oak walls of Family Courtroom 3, and for a moment it seemed as though every heartbeat inside the room had stopped with it. Judge Victoria Hale lowered her eyes to the papers before her, her expression composed, professional, and distant, the kind of face that had learned to separate emotion from duty after years behind the bench. Having reviewed the evidence presented, she said steadily, "This court finds that temporary custody of Lily Brooks shall be transferred to her maternal aunt, effective immediately." A quiet murmur rolled through the gallery before disappearing beneath the heavy silence that followed. Ethan Brooks never moved. He stood at the defense table wearing the only Navy sport coat he owned, its sleeves slightly worn at the cuffs from years of careful use. His calloused hands rested gently against the polished wood, not trembling, not clenched, simply still. He had spent countless nights rebuilding engines, changing brakes, and fixing transmissions to keep a roof over his daughter's head, yet nothing in his life had prepared him for standing only a few feet away while someone else decided where his little girl would sleep that night. Across the room, 8-year-old Lily Brooks looked far too small sitting beside a court-appointed advocate whose kind smile could not hide the sadness in her eyes. Lily's blonde hair was tied into the same uneven ponytail her father had learned to braid after her mother passed away 3 years earlier. It was never perfect, and Lily always laughed that Daddy's ponytails leaned a little to the left. Today she wasn't laughing. She stared only at her father. Her blue eyes filling with tears she was trying very hard not to let fall. Ethan met her gaze and offered the smallest smile he could manage. It wasn't a smile that promised everything would be fine. It was the smile of a father refusing to let his daughter carry his fear. Around them, attorneys quietly gathered folders. Reporters whispered into their phones. "Hey." Deputy Sheriff waited respectfully near the exit. Life inside the courtroom was already moving on, as though another family breaking apart was simply another case number waiting to be archived. Judge Hale signed the order with one smooth stroke of her pen. "Mr. Brooks," she continued, her voice calm but firm, "this decision is temporary pending future review. You will retain supervised visitation according to the schedule provided." Ethan nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." No protest, no raised voice, no desperate plea. His attorney had advised against emotional outbursts. But even without that advice, Ethan had always. Ethan Brooks drove home beneath a gray October sky that seemed unable to decide whether it wanted to rain or simply remain heavy with silence. His old Ford F-150 rolled slowly along the familiar Tulane roads outside Cedar Ridge, passing the diner where Lily always begged for pancakes on Saturday mornings, the little public library where she proudly checked out more books than she could carry, and the neighborhood park where she had learned to ride her bicycle after nearly a month of determined practice. Every place held a memory, and every memory reminded him that tonight she would not be waiting by the front window counting the minutes until he came home from work. He turned onto the gravel driveway and stopped in front of the modest white farmhouse that had belonged to his grandparents. The porch swing moved gently in the afternoon breeze, although no one sat there. Ethan remained behind the steering wheel for several seconds, his hands resting quietly where they had been throughout the drive. He could still hear Lily's trembling voice inside the courtroom. "Daddy the bear." She had not cried out for her backpack, her favorite books, or even the blanket she carried on difficult nights. She had asked only for the bear. There had to be a reason. He stepped inside the house, and the familiar scent of pine wood, cinnamon, and motor oil greeted him like an old friend refusing to give up hope. The silence inside the home felt different now. It was not peaceful. It was unfinished. A small pair of pink rain boots still rested beside the front door, exactly where Lily had left them before school 2 mornings earlier. A half-finished coloring page remained on the kitchen table beside a box of crayons, with one blue crayon worn almost to nothing because the sky in Lily's drawings was always enormous. Ethan slowly walked toward the hallway. Family photographs lined the walls. One showed Lily on her first day of kindergarten smiling proudly, with 2 missing front teeth. Another captured his late wife, Grace, laughing while flour covered her cheeks during one memorable attempt at baking homemade bread. Ethan stopped before that photograph longer than he intended. Grace had always believed that difficult days revealed who people truly were. Whenever life became overwhelming, she would squeeze his hand and remind him that truth never needed to shout because it always found its way into the light. Those words had carried him through her illness, through lonely birthdays, through every bedtime story he had learned to read alone. Today they seemed almost impossible to believe. He continued toward Lily's bedroom and gently pushed open the door. Afternoon sunlight filtered through pale blue curtains decorated with tiny white clouds. Everything remained exactly as she had left it that morning. Her stuffed animals sat neatly arranged across the bed as though waiting for their next adventure. Her bookshelf overflowed with fairy tales, science books, and stories about astronauts because Lily insisted she would visit the moon one day. Ethan smiled faintly despite the ache in his chest. Then he saw it. Resting against the pillow was Oliver, Lily's well-loved teddy bear. The once golden fur had faded with years of bedtime hugs, road trips, and tea parties. One button had been replaced after falling off during a camping trip when Lily was 5. Ethan slowly picked it up. It felt slightly heavier than he remembered. He turned it over in his hands, studying every worn seam. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Then he noticed a small line of fresh stitching along the bear's back. Grace had always been careful with repairs. Her stitches were nearly invisible. These were different, slightly uneven, more recent. Ethan frowned. Lily certainly had not sewn it herself. He carried the bear to the kitchen, opened the junk drawer, and retrieved a small seam ripper Grace had once used for sewing projects. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost respectful, as though he feared disturbing something precious. The thread loosened one careful stitch at a time. Inside the stuffing, his fingertips brushed against something smooth and solid. He gently reached deeper and pulled out a tiny digital voice recorder no larger than the palm of his hand. Dust clung lightly to its silver casing, but the small display flickered to life the moment his thumb brushed the power button. One battery bar remained. One audio file appeared on the screen. There was no label, no date, no explanation. Ethan stared at the recorder while the quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the empty kitchen. Outside, the wind stirred fallen leaves across the porch, and somewhere in the distance a church bell marked the passing hour. His heart beat just a little faster, not from fear, but from something far more fragile. Hope. Whatever waited inside that single recording had been hidden carefully enough for Lily to remember it even when every adult in the courtroom had forgotten to listen. Ethan drew a slow breath, rested the recorder carefully on the table beside Grace's old coffee mug, and reached toward the play button, unaware that the next few minutes would begin unraveling a story far older than the custody hearing itself. The tiny speaker released a faint click before the room, filled with several seconds of ordinary background noise. Ethan almost believed the battery had failed until he heard the familiar creak of his own kitchen chair followed by Grace's gentle laugh, warm and effortless, the sound he had replayed only in memory for the past 3 years. His breath caught. He closed his eyes for an instant, letting himself hear her voice without the weight of hospitals or goodbyes. Lily is upstairs drawing again, Grace said softly. She thinks every princess needs freckles. Another woman laughed politely. Ethan immediately recognized the second voice. Melissa Turner, Grace's older sister. The same woman who had stood confidently in court only hours earlier insisting that Lily would have a safer, more stable future living with her. Ethan frowned. Why would Grace have recorded an ordinary family conversation? The recording continued with the clink of coffee mugs resting on the kitchen table. For nearly a minute the conversation sounded harmless. They discussed Lily's school project, grocery prices, and the weather expected over the weekend. Ethan almost stopped listening. Then Grace's tone changed ever so slightly. It became quieter, thoughtful, almost cautious. Melissa, she asked gently, if anything ever happens to me, you promise me something? A brief pause followed. Of course, Melissa answered. Anything. Grace sighed. Promise me Lily stays with Ethan. She needs her father more than anything else. Silence filled the recording for several long seconds. Ethan leaned closer. Even the refrigerator in his kitchen seemed to hum more quietly, as though the house itself were listening. Finally, Melissa spoke again, but the warmth had disappeared from her voice. You always assume he will be enough. Grace answered without hesitation. He is enough. Another pause. Then Melissa replied in words that made Ethan's fingers tighten around the edge of the table. Love is not always enough. Stability matters too. If you are gone, I could give Lily opportunities Ethan never will. Grace let out a patient breath. Money is not the same as family. Melissa laughed softly, but there was little humor in it. You still believe that because you married a mechanic? Ethan stared at the recorder. His heartbeat grew louder with every passing second. He had never heard this conversation. Grace had never mentioned it. The recording crackled briefly before Grace answered again, her voice calm despite the obvious disagreement. I married the man who stayed beside me when there was nothing to gain. Lily deserves that kind of love every single day. More silence followed. Ethan imagined both women sitting at this very kitchen table years ago, sunlight falling across the same hardwood floor beneath his feet. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Melissa spoke so quietly that Ethan almost missed it. If circumstances change, people sometimes have to make difficult choices for children. Grace replied immediately, not if those choices ignore what the child actually needs. The conversation drifted back toward ordinary topics after that. Dishes clinked. Someone opened the back door. Lily's little footsteps could be heard running down the hallway before she proudly announced that her princess now had freckles and cowboy boots. Everyone laughed, including Melissa. The recording ended with Grace saying, "Maybe I should keep this little recorder around. It catches moments I never want to forget." The file stopped. Ethan remained perfectly still. Nothing in the recording proved anyone had broken the law. Nothing sounded dramatic enough to overturn a judge's ruling. Yet something deep inside him refused to let it go. Grace had hidden this recorder inside Lily's favorite teddy bear. She had stitched it there herself or asked Lily to protect it. Grace had never hidden ordinary memories. She believed important things belonged where they could be found when they were needed most. Ethan replayed the conversation from the beginning. This time he paid less attention to the words and more to the spaces between them. The hesitation before Melissa answered. The careful way Grace chose each sentence. The unmistakable feeling that one conversation had ended while another remained unspoken beneath it. Then he noticed something else. Just before the recording ended, another sound slipped quietly into the background. It lasted no more than 2 seconds. A man's voice. Faint, distant, almost impossible to understand. Ethan pressed rewind and listened again. The words were still buried beneath the scrape of a chair, but one phrase emerged clearly enough to send a chill through the silent kitchen. The paperwork will. The rest vanished into static. Ethan sat upright. Grace had believed she was recording family memories. Or perhaps she had captured something entirely different without ever realizing it. Suddenly, the single audio file no longer felt complete. It felt like the first piece of a puzzle that someone else had assumed would remain hidden forever. The recorder remained on the kitchen table long after the final sound faded into silence. Ethan listened again, then once more, each time closing his eyes whenever the unfamiliar man's voice appeared beneath the scrape of the chair. The words refused to become clearer, yet they refused to disappear from his thoughts. Grace had never been careless. If she had hidden the recorder inside Lily's favorite teddy bear, there had been a reason far greater than preserving happy family memories. Ethan carefully turned the device over in his hands and noticed something he had overlooked before. A tiny slot on the side held a removable memory card. His pulse quickened. He gently pressed it with his thumbnail until the card clicked free into his palm. It was smaller than a postage stamp, but suddenly it felt heavier than anything he had carried out of the courtroom that afternoon. Ethan walked into the small home office where an aging desktop computer still occupied the same wooden desk Grace had used to organize family photographs and school calendars. The computer took nearly 2 full minutes to start. Every passing second felt longer than the hearing itself. Outside the window, the sun slipped lower behind rows of maple trees, filling the room with warm golden light that reminded Ethan of autumn evenings when Grace brewed apple cider while Lily colored at the kitchen table. Those ordinary memories strengthened him. They reminded him that truth was built from ordinary moments, not dramatic speeches. The computer finally recognized the memory card. Ethan expected to find only the single recording he had already heard. Instead, one folder appeared on the screen. It contained no family photographs, no videos, and no collection of audio files. There was only one document. Its title was painfully simple. If you ever need this. Ethan stared at the words for several seconds before opening the file. His breath slowed as Grace's familiar writing appeared on the screen. She had typed only a few short paragraphs. Ethan, if you are reading this, something has happened that neither of us wanted. I pray this letter is never needed. If life has brought you here, do not panic. Listen before you react. Observe before you accuse. The truth has a way of revealing itself when people believe no one is paying attention. Ethan swallowed hard. Even years after her passing, Grace somehow sounded exactly like herself. Calm, patient, certain that kindness and wisdom belonged together. He continued reading. Several weeks ago, I accidentally recorded part of a conversation I do not fully understand. I almost erased it because I believed it was only background noise. Then I heard someone mention paperwork after Melissa visited. Maybe it means nothing. Maybe I imagined the importance of it. But if your heart ever tells you that something is wrong, promise me you will search for facts instead of anger. Lily deserves truth, not revenge. Ethan lowered his head. Grace had never accused her sister of wrongdoing. She had never written a warning filled with fear. She had simply trusted that one day, if the moment ever came, Ethan would know what to do. At the bottom of the document, she had added one final sentence. If the recording matters, someone else heard more than I did. Ethan read those words 3 times. Someone else. His mind searched through old memories. Family dinners, birthday parties, holiday gatherings. Then one face quietly emerged from the past. Emily Carter, Grace's closest friend since college. Emily had been sitting in the living room that afternoon, while Lily proudly showed off a cardboard castle she had built from moving boxes. Ethan remembered because Emily had laughed so loudly that Grace joked the neighbors could probably hear her from across the street. If Emily had been inside the house, perhaps she had noticed something Grace did not. Perhaps she had heard the conversation after the recorder had stopped. Ethan reached for his phone, hesitated, then placed it back on the desk. Emily had moved away nearly 2 years earlier after accepting a teaching position in another state. They had spoken only a handful of times since Grace's funeral. Calling her now would reopen old grief for both of them. Ethan looked once more at Grace's final words glowing softly on the computer screen. Search for facts instead of anger. He quietly nodded to himself. Tomorrow would not begin with accusations. It would begin with questions. And somewhere beyond those questions waited a truth that had been patiently hidden for years, trusting that the right person would eventually learn where to look. The next morning arrived wrapped in a pale layer of fog that softened the fields surrounding Ethan Brooks's farmhouse, but nothing could soften the questions that had followed him through a sleepless night. He had replayed Grace's recording until every pause and every breath felt familiar, yet the faint voice hidden beneath the conversation remained just beyond recognition. Grace had left him only one direction. Someone else heard more than I did. Ethan poured himself a cup of black coffee that quickly grew cold on the kitchen counter, then opened the worn address book Grace had insisted on keeping even after everyone else switched to digital contact lists. Her handwriting filled nearly every page with birthdays, recipes, and phone numbers written in neat blue ink. Emily Carter's name appeared near the center of one page beside a number that Ethan prayed had not changed. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang 3 times before a warm, familiar voice answered. Ethan. Emily sounded surprised, then immediately concerned. Is everything all right? Ethan looked toward Lily's empty chair at the kitchen table before answering honestly. No, it is not. Silence lingered for a moment. Emily had attended Grace's funeral, mailed birthday cards to Lily every year afterward, and never forgot to call each Mother's Day simply to check on them. She understood that when Ethan admitted something was wrong, he was not exaggerating. Tell me what happened, she said softly. Ethan explained everything from the custody hearing to the teddy bear, the recorder, Grace's letter, and the strange conversation hidden inside the old audio file. Emily listened without interrupting. When he finally finished, she released a slow breath. I have not thought about that afternoon in years, she admitted. But now that you mention it, something always bothered me. Ethan straightened in his chair. What do you remember? Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, he heard papers being moved across a desk and the quiet sound of a chair sliding backward. After Grace and Melissa finished talking in the kitchen, I stepped outside because Lily wanted to show me the birdhouse the two of you had built together. We stayed in the backyard for a few minutes. When we came back inside, I remember hearing a man's voice in the hallway. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Did you recognize him? No, Emily answered. I only caught part of the conversation before someone closed the study door. I assumed it was one of the insurance representatives because Grace had been organizing paperwork after her medical appointments. Ethan remembered those difficult months. Their dining room table had often disappeared beneath folders, insurance forms, and handwritten notes. None of it had seemed unusual at the time. Did Grace ever mention it afterward? He asked. Emily sighed. Not directly. But about a week later, she asked me a strange question. Ethan waited. She asked whether legal documents could ever be changed after someone signed them. I told her I did not know and suggested she speak with an attorney. She smiled and changed the subject. Ethan closed his eyes. Another small piece settled into place, but the picture remained incomplete. Emily suddenly spoke again, this time with greater certainty. Wait, there is something else. Ethan gripped the phone a little tighter. Grace left one cardboard box in my attic after she cleaned out the school classroom where she volunteered. She said she would pick it up someday, but after everything happened, I forgot about it. I never opened it because it was taped shut with her handwriting across the top. Ethan felt hope return, quiet but unmistakable. Do you still have it? I believe I do. Emily paused as footsteps echoed across her home. A closet door opened, followed by the sound of heavier boxes being shifted across the floor. Nearly a minute passed before she spoke again, slightly out of breath. It is here. Ethan exhaled slowly. What does it say? Tape peeled away. Cardboard rustled. Emily read the words written. Across the lid. For Lily. Open only if the right time comes. Neither of them spoke. Hundreds of miles separated them, yet both understood that Grace had never believed in coincidences. Emily carefully lifted the lid, moved aside several children's books, an old watercolor painting, and a folded quilt before stopping abruptly. Ethan, she whispered. There is an envelope underneath everything. His voice became almost inaudible. What is written on it? Emily turned it over. Her answer came slowly, each word carrying more weight than the last. It says, give this to Ethan only if someone tries to separate him from Lily. Emily did not open the envelope. She held it carefully in both hands as though Grace herself had just placed it there moments earlier. I think this belongs to you, she said quietly. Ethan looked through the kitchen window as the first rays of morning sunlight dissolved the lingering fog across the fields. Can you come today? He asked. I will leave right now, Emily answered without hesitation. It is about a 4-hour drive, but I will be there before lunch. The call ended, and for the first time since the courtroom hearing, Ethan felt that he was no longer carrying the burden alone. Grace had trusted someone else with part of the truth, and Emily had honored that trust for years without even knowing it. The morning passed slowly. Ethan tried to organize the growing collection of clues across the kitchen table. The tiny voice recorder rested beside Grace's handwritten letter. The memory card lay inside a small plastic case. A notebook quickly filled with names, dates, and questions. Grace had once told him that confusion became smaller when written on paper because the truth liked order. He smiled faintly at the memory and continued writing. Shortly after noon, a silver sedan rolled into the gravel driveway. Emily stepped out carrying a weathered cardboard box against her chest. She looked older than Ethan remembered, not because of wrinkles, but because grief had quietly matured everyone who had loved Grace. They embraced without speaking. Some friendships never required many words. Inside the house, Emily carefully placed the box. On the kitchen table, the envelope still rested exactly where she had found it beneath the children's books and folded quilt. Grace's handwriting stretched neatly across the front. For Ethan, open only if someone tries to separate him from Lily. Ethan traced the familiar handwriting with one finger before carefully breaking the seal. Inside rested 3 folded pages and a smaller sealed packet marked with another short instruction. Only if necessary. Ethan unfolded the letter first. Grace's words were steady, thoughtful, and unmistakably her own. If you are reading this, then something has happened that I feared but prayed would never come. I do not know whether my concerns were justified or whether I simply worried too much during a difficult season of life. Either way, I promised myself that if questions ever surrounded Lily's future, I would leave you everything I knew instead of everything I feared. Ethan continued reading, barely noticing the tears gathering in his eyes. Melissa began asking unusual questions after my diagnosis. She repeatedly wanted to discuss insurance policies, guardianship paperwork, and legal documents. None of those questions were wrong by themselves. Families often discuss difficult subjects. But several conversations left me unsettled because they seemed focused more on assets than on Lily's happiness. I never accused her because I did not have proof that anything improper had happened. Please remember that. Never accuse without evidence. Truth deserves patience. Emily quietly wiped her eyes as Ethan turned to the second page. One afternoon, I accidentally recorded part of a conversation. Later, I realized another voice appeared after I believed the recording had ended. I could never identify the speaker. Before I had time to investigate further, my health became worse. That is why I placed copies of several important papers somewhere safe. Ethan stopped reading. Copies? Emily asked softly. Ethan nodded and opened the smaller sealed packet marked only if necessary. Inside rested a neatly folded sheet of paper listing the location of a safety deposit box at Cedar Ridge Community Bank, along with a key taped carefully beneath. The note. Grace had written one final instruction beneath the key. Everything inside belongs to Lily. If the truth is ever questioned, begin here. Ethan and Emily looked at each other without speaking. Neither of them had known the safety deposit box even existed. Grace had quietly prepared for possibilities she hoped would never become reality. Ethan picked up the small brass key. It felt surprisingly warm in his hand despite having rested untouched inside the envelope for years. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the maple trees lining the driveway, carrying golden leaves across the yard in slow circles. The world appeared peaceful, unchanged, almost ordinary. Yet inside the quiet farmhouse, another door had just opened. Whatever waited inside that bank vault had been protected not by locks alone, but by Grace's unwavering belief that truth, when guarded with patience and dignity, always arrived exactly when it was needed most. The drive to Cedar Ridge Community Bank took less than 15 minutes, yet every mile seemed to carry Ethan farther away from despair and closer to the answers Grace had carefully protected. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat, holding the envelope on her lap, while autumn sunlight flickered through rows of towering oak trees that lined the country highway. Neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with conversation. Grace had already spoken through her letters, and somehow her steady wisdom remained present inside the truck long after her voice had disappeared. When they arrived, the small brick bank looked exactly as Ethan remembered from years earlier. Fresh flower beds framed the entrance, an American flag moved gently in the breeze above the parking lot, and the same brass clock still stood behind the teller counter. It was the kind of hometown bank where employees greeted customers by name instead of account number. A gray-haired branch manager named Harold Benson looked up from his desk and immediately recognized Ethan. His warm smile softened when he noticed the expression on Ethan's face. "It has been a long time," Harold said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I believe my late wife rented a safety deposit box here." Harold's eyes shifted toward the small brass key resting in Ethan's palm. His expression became thoughtful before he opened a secure file cabinet and reviewed several records. After a few moments, he looked up again. "Yes, Grace Brooks opened the box about 6 months before she passed away. She left very specific instructions that access could be transferred only to you after her passing if you presented both the key and identification." Ethan handed over his driver's license. Harold compared the information carefully before offering a gentle smile. "Please follow me." They walked through a heavy security door into a quiet vault where rows of steel deposit boxes covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Harold unlocked one side of the narrow compartment and stepped back respectfully. "Take all the time you need." After he quietly left the room, Ethan slid the small metal box onto a wooden table beneath a warm reading lamp. His hands remained steady as he lifted the lid. Inside rested several neatly organized folders secured with colored ribbons. Grace had labeled each one in her familiar handwriting. Family documents, medical records, Lily, legal copies, personal letters. Everything had been arranged with remarkable care, as though she wanted to make certain no one searching for the truth would ever become lost. Ethan reached first for the folder marked legal copies. Inside rested certified duplicates of guardianship papers, insurance documents, and handwritten notes explaining why Grace had chosen Ethan as Lily's sole guardian should anything happen to her. Attached to one page was a notarized letter addressed to any future court reviewing custody. Grace had written, "My husband is the parent I trust above every other person to raise our daughter with kindness, stability, and unwavering love. Any suggestion otherwise would be entirely against my wishes." Emily quietly covered her mouth as she read over Ethan's shoulder. "Why was this never presented during the hearing?" she whispered. Ethan slowly turned another page and immediately understood why. Grace had made the copies for protection, but the originals listed in the court records appeared to contain additional handwritten annotations that were not present on these certified duplicates. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. Someone had added notes suggesting Grace wanted Melissa to serve as Lily's preferred guardian if circumstances changed. Ethan stared at the pages in disbelief. Grace's certified copy contained no such language. Emily leaned closer. "Those notes were not on the documents I remember helping Grace organize." Ethan carefully compared every line. The signatures matched perfectly. The notarization dates matched as well. Only the handwritten additions were different. His heart pounded, yet Grace's words echoed through his mind. Search for facts instead of anger. He gently returned the papers to the folder and reached for another labeled personal letters. Beneath several family photographs rested a business card with a handwritten note on the back. It belonged to Daniel Foster, an attorney specializing in family law. Grace had written only one sentence beneath his name. "If questions ever arise, he will know where to begin." Ethan looked toward Emily, who slowly nodded without saying a word. Neither of them celebrated the discovery. Neither rushed toward conclusions. They simply stood together inside the quiet bank vault surrounded by carefully preserved truth, realizing that Grace had anticipated confusion without surrendering to fear. Outside the thick steel door, the ordinary rhythm of the small town continued without interruption. But inside that silent room, the first undeniable evidence had finally emerged, and somewhere beyond those documents waited the opportunity to place truth before the court with the same quiet dignity Grace had carried throughout her life. Daniel Foster's office occupied the second floor of a century-old brick building overlooking Cedar Ridge's courthouse square, where maple leaves drifted lazily across the sidewalks and people carried on with ordinary conversations, unaware that a family's future was quietly changing only a few hundred feet away. Ethan and Emily climbed the narrow wooden staircase, carrying Grace's folders inside a weathered leather briefcase that had once belonged to her father. Daniel greeted them personally before leading them into a conference room lined with shelves of legal books worn smooth from decades of careful use. He appeared younger than Ethan expected, perhaps in his late 30s, but his calm eyes reflected the patience of someone who understood that family law was rarely about winning arguments and almost always about protecting people. Ethan placed the certified copies, Grace's letters, and the tiny voice recorder carefully across the polished table. Daniel did not rush toward conclusions. Instead, he read every page slowly, occasionally making brief notes before continuing. Nearly 40 minutes passed before he finally leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your wife was remarkably organized," he said quietly. "She anticipated uncertainty without making accusations, and that matters more than you probably realize." Ethan nodded. "Can these documents help bring Lily home?" Daniel answered with careful honesty. "They can, if we present them correctly. Courts do not respond well to emotion alone. They respond to credible evidence, consistent facts, and reliable documentation. Grace has given us all three." Emily then described the conversation she remembered hearing years earlier, including the unfamiliar man's voice and Grace's concern about legal paperwork. Daniel listened without interrupting before asking only a few precise questions. "Did Grace ever directly accuse Melissa of changing documents?" Emily shook her head. "Never." Daniel smiled faintly. "That restraint may become one of our strongest advantages. Grace documented facts instead of assumptions." Ethan removed the recorder from its protective case and played the audio once more. Daniel listened through headphones with complete concentration, replaying the final seconds several times. Instead of focusing only on the faint male voice, he adjusted the volume to isolate background sounds. After several minutes, he slowly removed the headphones and looked toward Ethan. "The sentence itself is still difficult to identify," he admitted. But I noticed something different. Ethan leaned forward. What? Daniel replayed the final seconds through external speakers. Listen to the sound immediately before the man's voice. Ethan listened carefully. At first he heard only the scrape of a chair. Then another faint sound emerged beneath it. 3 soft electronic tones. Daniel nodded. That sounds very similar to the notification chime used by older office copy machines whenever a document finishes printing. Emily looked surprised. So the conversation may not have happened in the kitchen? Daniel smiled. Exactly. The recorder probably remained inside the house, while someone stepped into Grace's study, where she kept her printer and document files. The voices became distant because they moved into another room. Ethan immediately remembered the small home office connected to the hallway by a partially open door. Grace often left paperwork printing while preparing dinner. Daniel continued arranging the documents into neat stacks. Here is what concerns me most. The certified copies inside the safety deposit box were created before any handwritten notes appeared on the court versions. Certified copies are extremely difficult to dismiss because they preserve exactly what existed at that moment. If later editions changed the meaning of those documents, the court deserves to know. Ethan remained silent. He had imagined coming here hoping for encouragement. Instead, he found something stronger. A careful legal path built entirely upon patience rather than anger. Daniel opened his calendar before looking directly at Ethan. I believe we have sufficient grounds to request an emergency review hearing. Not because we can prove misconduct today, but because we possess credible evidence that important guardianship documents deserve independent examination. Ethan slowly exhaled. For the first time since Lily had walked through the courtroom doors, hope no longer felt fragile. It felt responsible. Daniel gathered every folder with meticulous care before placing the recorder inside a padded evidence envelope. One more thing, he said quietly. I know Judge Victoria Hale by reputation. She values integrity above appearances. If reliable evidence suggests the court may have relied upon incomplete or altered information, she will not ignore it. Good. Judges do not fear correcting honest mistakes. Outside the office window, the courthouse stood bathed in late afternoon sunlight, its white columns glowing against the blue October sky. Ethan looked toward the building where he had quietly lost his daughter only days before. This time, he was not returning with desperation in his heart. He was returning with Grace's voice, her carefully preserved truth, and a quiet confidence that sometimes the strongest case was built not by the loudest argument, but by the smallest details patiently waiting to be heard. 3 days later, the courtroom felt remarkably different, even though nothing about the room itself had changed. The same polished benches reflected the morning sunlight. The same county seal hung behind the bench. The same clock marked each passing second with quiet precision. Yet this time the silence carried expectation instead of defeat. Ethan Brooks stood beside Daniel Foster with Grace's certified documents arranged neatly across the counsel table and the tiny voice recorder resting inside a clear evidence envelope. Emily Carter sat quietly in the gallery, her hands folded together as though silently honoring the promise she had unknowingly kept for years. When Judge Victoria Hale entered, she greeted the room with the same calm professionalism that had guided every hearing before her. But her expression grew more thoughtful as Daniel respectfully requested permission to present newly discovered evidence that had not been available during the original custody proceeding. There were no dramatic accusations, no raised voices, no emotional performances. Daniel spoke with measured confidence, carefully explaining how Grace Brooks had preserved certified legal copies, personal letters, and a contemporaneous audio recording years before her passing. One by one, each document was introduced, authenticated, and compared with the versions previously submitted to the court. Judge Hale examined every page herself. She noticed the handwritten annotations appearing on the custody documents presented during the earlier hearing. Then she compared them with Grace's certified copies from the safety deposit box. The differences were subtle but unmistakable. She requested a brief recess while the court clerk independently reviewed the certification records. 20 minutes later, the hearing resumed. The courtroom remained so quiet that even the turning of a single page seemed unusually loud. Judge Hale looked toward Melissa Turner with neither anger nor accusation, only careful seriousness. She explained that the newly presented evidence raised significant questions regarding the reliability of several documents previously relied upon by the court. She then listened as the audio recording played softly through the courtroom speakers. Grace's gentle voice filled the room once more, speaking not with fear or resentment, but with unwavering confidence in Ethan's character. When the recording reached the moment where Grace quietly declared, "He is enough," no one interrupted. Those three simple words carried more weight than any lengthy argument could have accomplished. Daniel then presented the certified letter in which Grace clearly expressed her wish that Ethan remain Lily's guardian. The independent document review confirmed that the handwritten annotations appearing on the earlier court copies had not existed on Grace's certified originals. Judge Hale lowered her glasses and remained silent for several long moments before speaking. "The responsibility of this court is not to defend previous decisions," she said calmly. "The responsibility of this court is to follow credible evidence wherever it leads." She looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Brooks, based upon the evidence presented today, this court finds that the prior custody order cannot stand in its current form." Another quiet pause settled across the room. "Temporary custody is immediately restored to you pending final administrative review, and the court orders a formal examination of all disputed documentation to ensure the integrity of these proceedings." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not because he wished to hide his emotions, but because gratitude sometimes arrived too gently for words. A side door opened, and only a few minutes later Lily hurried into the courtroom accompanied by a family services representative. The little girl searched the room until she found her father. Her face brightened with the unmistakable relief that only a child can express. Ethan knelt before she reached him, and Lily wrapped both arms tightly around his neck while he held her with quiet tenderness. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply remained together, allowing the silence to say everything their hearts already understood. Judge Hale watched the reunion with thoughtful eyes before quietly addressing the courtroom one final time. "This case reminds every person here that justice depends not only upon laws, but upon careful listening, honest evidence, and the humility to correct mistakes when truth becomes clearer." As people slowly departed, Ethan gathered Grace's letters, the recorder, and the neatly organized folders. Before leaving, he pressed the play button one last time. Grace's laughter drifted softly from the tiny speaker, followed by her familiar voice saying, "If Lily ever asks what matters most, tell her kindness will always outlive fear, and truth never loses its way." Ethan smiled through grateful tears as Lily squeezed his hand. Together they stepped outside into warm autumn sunshine where golden leaves danced across the courthouse steps. The long shadow of uncertainty had finally given way to quiet dignity, proving that the strongest voices are not always the loudest, and that sometimes the smallest act of faithful preparation can protect a family long after the one who prepared it is gone.